Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion. We'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this period of factoring the truth of God's Word into our and hopefully your daily life. We've been away for about 3 weeks due to me being out of town and other things going on within our lives, but we are back again for another time period of Bible study. We don't have with us today Wayne. He was unable to make the study today, as well as Paul. Both of them have other things that have required them to be away, and that's perfectly understandable. We all have our own lives, and sometimes something else comes up on Wednesday that we have to tend to. But we're glad that you're able to join us today, and maybe if you're watching this at some future point, I would like to thank you for your interest as well. Now, if you'd like to participate in today's study, there are two different ways you could do that. You can go, if you're watching us at live.truthfactor.com, we have a chat room there that you can sign in as guest. Give us at least your first name if you would. And if you have a question or comment during the course of the study, drop it in there and we'll try to monitor it and bring it to our study. If by chance you're watching this on our Facebook page at facebook.com/truthfactorlive, you can participate in the study there. Just drop in your comment as we go through the study, and we'll be watching for that and try to bring that into the study as well. You can also reach us after the study at questions@truthfactor.com. So let's see, gentlemen, we're just a little bit past 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and step right into the study. And let's see, Eric, I'll throw it over to you if you would, and let us know, tell everybody about what we're looking at today.
All right, be glad to, John. Thanks. We are studying the awesome chapter of Hebrews 11 today. We've been working our way through the book of Hebrews, and we've reached chapter 11. And this is one of those chapters that is often used for lessons. It's an easy chapter to preach. It's just chock full of well-known Bible characters, and it brings out several commendable things about them and their faith. And so there's plenty of lessons and plenty of things to dive into and to discuss, and it makes it really one of the more practical and preachable chapters in this great book of Hebrews. And so that's what we'll be looking at today as we begin going through this. We don't anticipate that we will finish going through all of these characters that are mentioned here in Hebrews 11, but we're going to just take it as we go and see how far we get in our discussion today. To set the stage for this, I'd like to mention that sometimes, and I've been guilty of this in the past, Hebrews 11 is such a teachable chapter that we sort of just zoom right into it and not really pay attention to the context. But it's interesting to notice the preceding and the following context and how this fits into the flow of the book of Hebrews and the point that the author is making. In chapter 11, which we discussed last time, he tells them in verse 23 that we need to hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering. And so he's preparing them that difficulties are going to come as they hold on to their faith. And he tells them in verse 32 of chapter 10, he reminds them, recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. So he reminds them, you guys have already suffered some, and you're going to suffer more. And then he says in verse 35, therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. So the danger is they were going to be facing some difficulties, and they need to hold on and have endurance. And in fact, that's what he says in verse 36, you need endurance. And then finally, in verse 39, at the end of chapter 10, he says, we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. So the thought at the close of chapter 10 is you're going to face suffering, hardships, and difficulty, but you need to have endurance. You need to hold on to your confidence, and you need to have faith. You need to live by faith. Now, we won't go there at this point and read it because we'll be getting to it soon. But in chapter 12, he's going to return to this theme of enduring suffering and talk about how the Lord is using that as a father disciplines his son. And so really you have chapter 11 sandwiched between these two sections that talk about bearing up under difficulties and trials and suffering and perhaps even facing death. And so he says at the end of chapter 10, what you have to do is live by faith. And that really rolls right into the theme of chapter 11, which is what does it mean to live by faith? How can we endure hardships and sufferings, and how do we hold on to this confidence as we live by faith? And I believe that Hebrews 11 is basically, he just explores that idea with lots of biblical examples as illustrations. So that hopefully kind of sets the context of chapter 11, what's going on in the larger context of the book. And now we'll begin to look a little closer at chapter 11. I'm going to just introduce the first 3 verses, and then we're going to open it up for our panel discussion. So if you would, John, bring up verse 1 there of Hebrews 11.
All right.
He says here, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So faith deals in the realm of what we can't see, and it is the conviction that gives us that confidence to hold on to what we have, believed, the promises of God. And then he says, by it, the people of old received their commendation. Now that introduces the whole chapter. He's going to support that claim with lots of examples of people of old who were commended by their faith. And then he says in verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Again, here's the theme, that faith deals with the realm of what cannot be seen. By faith, into the future, we look forward to promises of God that we haven't yet seen. And he's going to show how these characters did that. They believed in things they hadn't seen yet. They believed in the future promises of God. And looking backward, by faith, we believe in the Creator. We believe that he spoke things into existence. We can't see creation, and we can't see our hope of our home in heaven. Both of those are invisible to us, but we believe both of those things by faith. He's going to echo this in verse 6, where he says, whoever draws near to God must believe that he exists, that there is a creator, and that he rewards those who seek him in the future. So with that in mind, the themes we're going to look for as we look at these characters are, faith has confidence in the promises of God yet to come. Faith believes in what has not yet been seen. Faith produces obedience, and faith endures adversity and even death. I think that hopefully that introduces the thoughts of the chapter and what we're going to see. So now we're going to look at some of these examples that he uses to illustrate these points that he's saying. So first of all, I guess before we start, do you guys have anything you'd like to add to the overall context or theme message of the chapter in a general sense?
One thing I like to kind of bring to mind here, Eric, is I noticed you were reading from the English Standard Translation, and it uses the term the conviction of things not seen. It is interesting when you look up the definition for the word translated as faith, and I think it would be in this case in point 2. Part of the definition is a conviction or a persuasion. I think oftentimes we think about faith meaning simply to believe something, but this faith is something that should result in a conviction. It's only a conviction, only a persuasion that will change a person's life. And so here we have this faith as assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. If we're not persuaded that those things which cannot be seen exist, then we're not going to have the faith needed to live faithfully.
Right.
So
building a little on that, typically when I talk about the subject of faith, and like if I'm preaching on this chapter, I will make sure that people understand the difference between believing in God and believing God, because there's some confusion about that today, and amongst many in the religious world. Genuine faith is not just believing in; it is believing. You believe what God says, and I'll also use the word trust. And as we go through every one of these examples in Hebrews chapter 11, that's exactly what you find. Eric mentioned the endurance, which really bookends the chapter. And you see that in every one of these examples. They believe God. Incidentally, as we'll see, not everything goes their way. Not everything goes the way they intended for it to, but they continue to persist, and they continue to believe, and they continue to trust God regardless.
That's a good point. That's a good point, Tom. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Eric, I guess we'll throw it back over to you then.
Okay, so we'll begin by just kind of walking through these characters, and we'll just discuss them as much as you guys feel like talking about them. We'll just move from one to the next, and hopefully we'll see how they fit into the flow of the thought. And so I'd like to ask Brian if you have any thoughts on what he has to say about Abel in this regard.
Thank you very much, Eric. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained a witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead still speaks. I really like what you said earlier about one of the things we learn in this chapter is that faith works, which is the case of every single example. I've often said Hebrews chapter 11 parallels James chapter 2 in the language of faith without works being dead, and that every one of these people, their faith is demonstrated by their works. In Abel's case, it's the sacrifice that he offers. And what's important about that is that Cain also offered a sacrifice, but it was not the righteous sacrifice. It was not the sacrifice that God desired. I know many times people ask the question, well, how could they know? And sometimes we answer and we think maybe perhaps God had spoken to them or revealed it to them. But also we might consider that back in Genesis chapter 3, the chapter before we read about Cain and Abel's sacrifice, we see God making the first sacrifice when he took animal skins, presumably to slay animals to do so, to cover up the nakedness of Adam and Eve. The first sacrifice, the first act of covering sin, so to speak, and that from that we learned that God gives us examples that we might follow. And perhaps that might be the point with Abel, that we see his sacrifice as righteous because he looked at what God had done, he perceived what God desired, and he acted upon it, whereas Cain merely went through the actions without actually discerning the will of God. And this is where Cain failed, and this is where Abel acted in faith. Of course, the bigger point here that the Hebrew writer makes is the testimony of Abel's blood. He'll come back to that, in fact, later in the book. He'll, in chapter 12 and verse 24, he'll contrast the testimony of Abel's blood with the testimony of Christ's blood. And if we recall back in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 10, the testimony of Abel's blood was condemnation, that having been spilt. And if you think about it, this is the first time that both a murder has happened, but that perhaps even someone has died. And that this idea testifies to the fact that life here is finite. It testifies that whenever somebody commits sin, that guilt of that sin follows after them and testifies against them in a greater sense. And those are both very important ideas to the concepts of faith. And finally, the idea that even though Abel is gone, he yet speaks. This kind of comes back later too when we think of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Jesus saying, God's not the God of the dead, but of the living. That Abel yet lives and yet testifies. And of course, this is accomplished by faith. And our understanding of this is by faith as well. And so we see a few important things here with what was offered, the testimony of the righteous gift and the acceptable gift before God being the one that pursues the mind of God and desires to offer the things that God desires to receive. We can apply that idea to so many different things we do today, to worship. We know that, God has revealed to us his desire is that we offer the fruit of our lips, singing. And yet many men add to worship the instrumental music because it's what they desire. That's the distinction of Cain and Abel, and the sacrifices made there.
I really appreciate your point about that and exploring what made his offering acceptable. I think you bring to mind some interesting possibilities for that. And I agree with you that in the flow of the thought here, it's important to note that he returns to this. And I wish that Paul was with us today, because Paul brought out an aspect of this to me in our discussion back and forth outside of our program that I wish he was able here to kind of explore as he sees it. But he wanted to remind us that over and over in the book of Hebrews, we're seeing how Jesus is superior to everything else and everyone else. And so you mentioned that even in chapter 12, he'll use this to say that his blood speaks of better things than the blood of Abel. So the better things about Christ is another theme that each of these characters stands as an example of faith, but they're also all in some ways pointing to the ultimate example of Jesus. And then finally, I want to also bring to mind, as we read through these, how often death is going to be mentioned. You mentioned that his blood and his death. Once you start looking for that, it starts to catch your ear as you see it. And so death comes up in a surprising number of these verses. And I would take that to imply or to show that he's encouraging them to understand you need faith to believe in the promises of God, even beyond the end of your earthly life. You might die without having received the ultimate promise of God, but so did so many before us, and yet they live on, as you said. They're not gone. They continue to live on, and so does Abel, and so will we. And that's something that we believe by faith.
You know, Eric, one thought before we continue. You think about what Revelation 2, the latter part of verse 10. Oftentimes we think of that, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. We think about it meaning, well, I need to be faithful until the day I die. But he may be pointing out there, be faithful even if it is unto your death. You know?
Right. I think that is right.
And that's
right
right there what you're talking about. So, all right.
All right. Well, the next person in our list of Bible characters of faith, Tom, is Enoch. What does he have to say about Enoch?
Well, he makes the point there in verse number 5. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. Now, when you look at Enoch, Enoch is an interesting character in that we know so little about him. As far as actual time frame, he's one of these individuals. In the Old Testament, the only thing we're told about him is that he walked with God. And it's actually in the midst of a list of genealogy, which is taking us from Adam to Noah, and he just seemed to stand out from the rest of the world. And I think that's one of the significant observations to make about Enoch as he walked with God. He did not follow the paths of the world. He knew what God wanted. He trusted God, and so he followed God, and that's why he was described as walking with God. And of course, the point that is made in this text, because of the way that he walked, he did not see death. He's one of only two individuals in the Old Testament of which we're told they did not die. The other one being Elijah, and that's what I find remarkable in this particular text. He trusted God so much that God, and I don't know why, maybe to make a point with the world or whatever, he took him out of the world. I heard it described one time about Enoch, and I know this is fictitious, but it kind of tells the story. Enoch was walking with God, and then one day, God said to him, "You know what? You're closer to my place than your own, so why don't you come on home?" Wow. That's a good description, as opposed to the rest of the world. And what I see in this is our willingness to stand out. And when we have faith, we're going to stand out. Not just to be different, but if we have genuine faith, and if God genuinely is the ruler of our life, and we're not of this world, and we understand that, we are going to stand out. We're going to be like the King James says in the book of Peter, 1 Peter, a peculiar people. And I know that that's a word that means his own special people. But the world's going to see that in us, and that's what we see in Enoch.
Our next character is going to be Noah, but before that, we have this verse 6 where he makes this interjection about faith and believing that God exists and that he rewards those. Do you want to say anything about that, Tom? You have any thoughts on that verse, or anyone else?
Well, I think that that's one of the key verses that the Hebrew writer is emphasizing when he talks about faith here in this verse 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So you've got the idea in that text there. You cannot please God without not just believing, but you cannot please God without the type of faith that is being described here. And like you said at the beginning, an obedient faith or a working faith, an enduring faith. That has to be there. And even in this verse, you know, he starts off with the idea, you know how I made the point that faith is not merely believing in God, but it is believing God. Actually, this verse mentions both of those, you know, where he says, he who comes to God must believe that he is. That's the idea of believing in God. But then he goes on and says, but he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. That's believing God. Believing what God says and doing what he says. And we see that in Enoch and others.
Right. What compels them forward, and I think this is his point to his audience, is a firm conviction and a confidence in that the fact that God will reward those who seek him. That is the very thing that we need to hold on to as well. Now, in the chat room on the Truth Factor page, we have a couple of comments from Stephen. Do you want to bring those up, Tom?
Hang
John.
on just a second. Let me bring those over here real quick.
Yeah.
Let's see. Hey, Eric. They're right there
Hello.
beside you.
Oh,
Which
yeah.
one do you want to start with?
Well, Stephen, you see the one from Stephen?
Yeah. Stephen has a question here where he asks the question, could Enoch be symbolic of someone or something? And my answer to that is, I don't know. I will say this. By faith, I accept that Enoch was a real character.
Yes, right.
You know, and he was a real person. I know we're not going to get into this study, but we know that there are those who advocate that the chapters of Genesis from Genesis 1 to the flood and maybe a little beyond that are actually not figurative or not literal, but rather there's a lot of figurative language in there, and they might read symbolism into some of these things. I do believe there are characteristics of faith associated with Enoch, but I do not necessarily see that this is so much symbolic of one. I preached a series of lessons on Hebrews 11 actually about 12 years ago. And the thing that I brought out about Enoch is he had a faith that pleased God. And you can take each one of these individuals, and there's some type of a quality that makes them stand out. This shows you what it means to please God. This is the depth to which we need to do that. So that's what I would say in that. And then let's see, he asked the other question there, which is, let's see, it seems that Abel almost foreshadows Christ. And again, that goes back to the observation that we'll get into that in chapter 12 when we talk about the righteous blood of Abel. And like you pointed out, Eric, many of these, maybe not all of them,
Right.
but many of these individuals in one way or another are a type of Christ in some form or fashion within his life. So if you call that symbolism, then yes, but that's my thoughts.
You know, one interesting thing, actually two interesting things. Tom said something really important that goes back to verse 3, and that is the characteristic of understanding Genesis. And verse 3 tells us that it is a matter of our faith that we understand that the things that exist now are created by things that don't exist in our reality, or things that which are that are not made from things visible. That would, of course, remove most of the theories that people have about where life or where all things came from. And scriptures are very definitely saying that this is a matter of our belief, that it was the word of God that brought these things into existence, whether it be life or humans or the earth or the seas, that this is something of paramount importance, that it's a concept of faith. And Tom was real good to bring that to us. Another thing I'd suggest about Enoch is we might remember in the book of Jude, Enoch is also a prophet of Jesus' second coming. You know, it's kind of interesting that as Tom mentioned, there are two people that were taken from the earth. We have Elijah and we have Enoch. And Elijah is brought back to the earth at the time of Christ in order to testify to the superiority of Christ, which is kind of a neat idea in the book of Hebrews to that end. And, you consider that the language of Enoch is that Enoch's testimony is to the return of Christ the second time. And so it's almost as though these two men were taken from the earth to book in these important points: the first coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ. And I've often wondered if maybe I shouldn't speculate. Just to say, it's very interesting to consider Enoch's testimony there in Jude and how it relates to his testimony here. And these are the things that we do, as Tom well said. We don't know a lot about Enoch, but these are the things we do know: that he's one of the earliest prophets, and that he is something of substance, and ultimately that his testimony of the return of Christ is of great and imminent importance to us.
All right. Well, thank you guys. As we'll continue moving along, the next character, John, is Noah. And how does Noah fit into the theme of this chapter?
Very nicely, Eric. He fits in very nicely.
Perfectly.
One thing I want to point out as we kind of begin looking here at Noah for just a second is you'll notice there, and this kind of piggybacks off of what y'all were talking about in regards to verse 6, but notice the connection here, and I'm going to highlight this on the screen, where in the latter part of verse 5, talking about Enoch, he says, now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And then the Hebrew writer says, and without faith you can't please God. Now you kind of think about that, the connection there. Because I've often wondered when you read through this, why does he pause to talk about this in verse 6? He's not pausing, he's just elaborating on, and y'all have already talked about this, just as Enoch was able to do this, we too can please God. Noah is a great example of an individual who had this same type of faith, who believed that God exists, as the English Standard Version says, and who believed that those who seek God will be rewarded by God. But listen to verse 7. He says, by faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. And then he says, by this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. It's a very interesting and very powerful observation. One of the things that we've observed before, when we talk about this particular letter here, the writing written by the writer here, this kind of reads as if it's a sermon. And while we believe in the clear inspiration of what is being spoken of here, he's clearly drawing some obvious lessons from these Old Testament characters. But yet he's drawing them in such a way that helps us to improve our lives and increase our faith. So think about Noah for a moment. All right, Noah was warned by God. But what's important, notice there in the phrase, in the wording, he was warned by God concerning events as yet unseen. Again, that comes back to the concept of faith, substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. God didn't say, hey, remember when that big old rainstorm we sent a couple weeks ago? Well, this is going to be 10 times worse. It's nothing like that. And then in reverent fear, he constructed an ark for the saving of his household. He did this because God told him to, and he feared God. He feared God. He feared what God was going to do, and he saw the need to reverently obey the Lord. And it is this example of faith that the Hebrew writer is telling us that enabled Noah to please God, just as Enoch was able to please God. We are able to please God, just as Noah did. One more thing about this, he says, by this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Two different interesting points here. Think about this first off. He condemned the world through his singular action of faith to God. He set the standard that everybody else fell short of. And then he became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. He became righteous, inherited that righteousness because of his faith in God. So that's kind of a couple thoughts I've got on Noah. Eric?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I noticed the idea also of it being an heir of the righteousness, and I almost feel like it's being handed down through this chapter, starting all the way back to Abel, and then it's sort of passing down through these. And I think the implication is that his audience is now on the receiving end of that. When we come to chapter 12, we're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. They've kind of handed down the baton of faith, and now it is our turn. to have this same kind of righteousness that comes by faith that's been passed down.
That's a good point.
Yeah, Eric, another interesting observation I make in that is in verse 7, obviously. I like the point that it says he moved with godly fear. And this goes a little along with the point that John was making, but that's talking about a reverence for God. He has this respect for God, which is what causes him to stand out and be different from the rest of the world. And that's why he was willing to do what God told him to do. There's a lot of things that we don't know about the world pre-flood, as far as, did it rain or was, because we know the world was taken care of by a mist and so on. It obviously was different than now. And, how close was Noah to water when he built this ark? Just various things associated with that. And he was doing something that probably produced mocking by those around him, even as he continued to do what God said. But the foundation of it was the reverence that he had for God.
Very good. All right, as we continue to move forward, the next thing is we come to Abraham, and we're going to see Abraham twice in this chapter. He makes a point about Abraham, and then he comes back to Abraham. So I've got that listed in the outline as A and B. Brian, this first one is what he says about Abraham in really verses 8 through 10, and I'll just turn that over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. I should have clarified, I'm reading from the New King James. Sorry, John. Let me just wait a second. I should have said that earlier. I apologize.
Oh, no, you're fine. Go ahead. I normally jump over to the full screen so they don't have to see me doing that stuff.
Verse 9, by faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. It's a really marvelous thing to consider the life of Abraham. There's a sermon many of us preach that talks about the various trials that Abraham went through in his life. Of course, the most important thing we know about Abraham is that in various books in the New Testament, he is identified as the father of those who are faithful. Of course, his very name was changed from Abram, great father, to Abraham, the father of many. And it's an interesting thing to see that we understand that Abraham's virtue in being our father of faith is something of great substance and great importance. I guess the question would be for many of us, why, since he wasn't the first person to have faith? And I would suggest that what we're seeing right here kind of gives us a sense of what that is. Abraham is the first person whose faith looks to a reward that he won't receive in his life. In other words, before him, men acted by faith, but like Noah, he acted for faith for something he would see happen in his life. Or Abel, he was offering by faith a sacrifice. Or Enoch walked with God, it was taken up. And these men all lived by faith. But Abraham's faith is the first faith that's like our own, that he does things now for promises that he won't receive in his life. And therefore, that kind of faith becomes the faith that we seek to have in our lives, a faith now for things that we won't have till later, till the next life, in other words. So that's an important point that we consider about Abraham. Now, the other point is it draws to us the type of obedience that Abraham had, that he separated himself from the world. And of course, that fundamentally describes the life of a Christian, somebody who has separated themselves from the world. To the very word church, we know, ecclesia means the called out body, those that are out of the world. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul goes into talking about how it is that we are not to have fellowship or communion with the world, that we're separate from the world. We've been called out from the world. And in doing so, God has become our God and we have become his people. Abraham, separating himself from the world in this way, becomes that image of what we're supposed to be doing, separating ourselves. Two more things to consider. In verse 9, he reminds us that he becomes the heir of the promise. That's a big deal in the Old Testament, of course, the language of the promise. And I don't know if we'll get a chance to get to it today, but one of the things I like to point out is that this promise Isaac and Jacob are also recipients of, and that this promise is the big deal of the Old Testament. It starts back in Genesis chapter 3 when the promise is made to Eve that through her these blessings would come. Now to Abraham that through him all nations will be blessed. This language of the promise becomes something central to this righteous line of people. Of course, ultimately that points to Christ. Verse 10, the other thing I wanted to bring up is this. He brings to us now the mention of a city. He's going to come back in a few verses and revisit this idea. And I've often suggested that this idea of the city is a central theme in the book of Hebrews. And I see it as a parallel to that city of refuge in the old law, the city that people flee to. As the Hebrew writer is going to say, we have fled to this place for refuge. This city of God is referenced again in Hebrews chapter 12, where we're told very plainly that the city of God is the heavenly Jerusalem, the church of the firstborn. Indeed, what we're seeing here in verse 10 is that we're being told that Abraham waited for the kingdom of Christ, the authority of Christ, the church of Christ, in other words, that he was looking ahead to these things. And we understand from passages like Ephesians chapter 3, verse 11, that the church was God's eternal purpose. It was what God was looking to all along. So it makes complete sense that those who were living by faith were looking for this as well. And that these promises they would receive, as Jesus says, you'll see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom. That they too will be recipients of that blessings, inheritors of that promise. And so that sense of they're looking forward to that brings us to the great blessings. And ultimately the very theme of the chapter, which is we're surrounded by witnesses. Now, I think of that idea of surrounded, they're all looking at us, that they're all seeing us and that in their faith they looked ahead and in some fashion they saw that which has been given to us. This first part of Abraham is just marvelous to consider, and the profound significance of the life of Abraham, very important to a Christian because, as we've already mentioned, he's identified as the founder or the father of the faith that we have today.
I think the point he makes there about him dwelling in tents is really remarkable because he says, if I understand his point, and it, just building on what you said, that he actually arrived at the promised land, and yet when he got there, he didn't build a house. He continued to live in a tent because he understood there was something yet to come. And that's amazing to me because I don't know that I would have ever put that together out of just reading Genesis. I don't know if the Holy Spirit had to help him understand that, or if there's something he picked up on there in the text that isn't, that I haven't ever picked up on. But he gives us some insight into the mindset of Abraham, that even when he got to the place where God said, I'm going to bring you to a place, he somehow recognized that even that wasn't the final place, that there's something beyond that. And so he continued to live as a stranger and live in tents, looking forward to something yet to come. At least I think that's what he's saying there, in addition to what you're saying about the ultimate fulfillment of that city being what we look forward to and understand today as well.
You know, it's neat to think of the language of tents when Peter uses it and talks about his body as the tent that he sets aside for that eternal home.
Yeah, that's a good connection. Other thoughts on Abraham before? Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Well, and obviously you're not done with Abraham because,
right.
You know, he's one of the few characters in this book that there's 2 or 3 things that are mentioned about him. And I just find it remarkable when you look at the life of Abraham, we sometimes describe him as the father of faith. And that's because as you look at his life, there are several times when his faith was tested. And quite honestly, he didn't always pass. You know, I mean, or as you might say, his faith, sometimes it wavered a little bit when he went to Egypt. When he went to Abimelech, you know, in both of those instances, he had Sarah alive for him, you know, which shows not complete and total trust in God. But I find it interesting as we begin here, the whole point that is made is here is Abraham settled, you know, in Mesopotamia. That's where he grew up. yet there he trusts God. And God says, I want you to go to a place. And then you have this language about a city, like Brian was talking about, which you find all throughout here. But yet he realizes that he never totally receives that place, while even in the land of Canaan. But he still trusts God.
We have a comment in the chat room, John.
All righty, let me grab
again from Stephen. In addition to some technical stuff that I guess we don't really probably need.
Which one do you start with?
Stephen seems unusual. It begins.
Let's see. All righty, and then I'll have you, if you would, Eric, just bring that in.
All right, he said it seems unusual that Abraham was never baptized in some manner, not even symbolically like Noah and the Israelites. Sometimes in the New Testament, we're shown that there were types and foreshadows of baptism, such as the people of Israel being led through the Red Sea and Noah in the ark and being saved through water and by water in 1 Peter 3. And he's just saying it is interesting that we don't see a type of that. If there is a type of baptism for Abraham, it would be in circumcision. I think we could see that in Colossians 2. And yet it isn't really nothing to do with water or immersion. But even though there are some of those types, there's nothing to say that there has to be one in every case. And for whatever reason, there isn't in this case. And Brian replies down below that there's other people, such as Isaac, Jacob, David, etc., that we also don't have a baptism typology or something there that foreshadows baptism in their story as well. So, in fact, I think it's almost the exception more than the rule. The fact that Noah was saved through water and the Israelites went through the Red Sea. There aren't very many others. If you can, I can't even know. I can think of any others where there is that foreshadowing of baptism in the Old Testament.
Yeah. The only thing that came to my mind when you were talking about that is maybe the life of Abraham, maybe the vision when God overcame him with that great vision. Where he told him that your descendants would be strangers in a foreign land for 400 years. Maybe that enveloping. But that would be a non-inspired preacher right here stretching that, and it might be. But you're right. And Jacob in the dream he had of the ladder going up,
mm-hmm.
One might see in there. But Isaac was pretty. Well, he spent all his time working for his wife, so.
We don't really have a reason to try to find one in every case either.
Yeah.
There's nothing that says.
That's the significance of the idea that it wasn't about teaching them, but teaching us. If it had been about teaching them about the significance of this idea, then I suspect there probably would have been a foreshadowing event in the lives of all of them that would have put it that way. But since it's really only 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, Romans 15:4 say it's really about just teaching us, then the fact that there's only these sporadic from time to time examples actually is just fine. I mean, it brings back to us when we look at the whole versus in their lifetimes experiencing something that was meant to teach them.
Yeah. And that's not necessarily to say that those events, like going through the children of Israel, were led through the water, that God said, okay, I'm going to do this so that in the future this can be used as a type of baptism. It's the event that took place, and then the inspired writers making the connection there, with the type and the antitype and so forth. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments?
Stephen replied just now to say that he sees that the point here being Abraham is obedience and faith, and that we certainly see.
Yes.
He went when he was called. And the faith was that he believed in a place where he hadn't been. And even when he got there, he continued to look forward. As Brian said, he was one of those who was looking at things far off. And we'll come back to that in just a moment when we come back to kind of a summary statement about these characters of faith. But before then, we come to Sarah. And she's there's a few people in this chapter that are very interesting by the fact that they're included. We'll get to some later, probably next week, down in the sort of the summary of what shall I say about Samson and Jephthah? And I really wish that he had elaborated a little more on a couple of those. But in this case, he has a few things to say about Sarah, and they're almost surprising when you kind of recall her story. But I'll turn it over to Tom to talk about how Sarah fits into the theme of this chapter.
All right, yeah. Verses 11 and 12 of this text. I don't know, John, you want to pop that up? Or yeah, oh, you got it there. Okay. Yeah, by faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. And so here we read about Sarah, who is Abraham's wife. And Eric is right that her progression where faith is concerned is interesting, because I would describe hers as a wavering faith. Not that she did not have faith, but there were certainly times where her faith was not what it ought to be. And that's the point that Eric is bringing out. You read about this in Genesis 17, and also when you get into Genesis 21, where Isaac is finally conceived. But in Genesis 17, an angel appears. Abraham's been trying to help God fulfill his promise. And, basically, God says, you don't have to do that. I'll take care of it. But when Sarah is told you're going to have a son, she laughs. And in the text, that laughing indicates a doubt. She looked at her barrenness and her age, and she said, how's this going to happen? But of course, she is rebuked. And that probably leads into why she's listed here. And an interesting observation to be made is, while Sarah did doubt, when the time came for it to happen, she accepted what was said. And that's really, if you'll notice in Hebrews 11, the events that are mentioned in the lives of some of these individuals, it's interesting what's picked out. Think of all the things in the life of Moses when we get to him, or in the life of Joseph. And yet there's only one event mentioned about Joseph, his bones. So the things that are, the event that is picked out is what we focus on. And here it is. She received strength to conceive seed, this is Genesis 21, about the first 3 or 4 verses there. And at 90 years of age, she has Isaac, her first and only son. And she bears this child. And it's because she judged him faithful who had promised. She accepted that God is able to do what he says he is able to do. And there's a great lesson for us in that. God is able to do what is needed, even if we don't know how, even if we don't understand it. God, if he makes a promise, God can and will fulfill that promise. And that's part of faith, is trusting God in those particular circumstances. And of course, as a result of that, verse 12 is giving us the result of this faith, her believing God and being willing to go through with what God said was going to happen. She has basically becomes the mother of the genealogy that would lead to Christ, which is the fulfillment of Genesis 12, 1 through 3. One other interesting thing I want to observe about this, though, is that she's called Sarah here, as opposed to Sarai, when when the laughing actually took place and so on. And I think it's actually in chapter 21, if I'm not mistaken, where her name is changed to Sarah, which has to do with being an exalted mother, and so on. And I find it interesting that the name that's given to her is the post birth of Isaac name. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Sarah.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to point out, as we looking for the word and references to death, notice that he says that she was well past the age, and then in verse 12 it said he was as good as dead. And yet, that, as you said, didn't stop God from carrying out his plans. And I think one of the themes here is that patience and conviction and confidence that God can carry out his plans, and even death won't stand in the way. I think that's probably one of the things he intends to bring to mind with that. He was as good as dead. He was nearly dead, and that didn't keep God from bringing about the promise that he had made.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And as far as the genealogy was concerned, Sarah was also as good as dead. You know,
Right.
Abraham already had a son. You know, his name was Ishmael, and we find it interesting that after Sarah dies, that Abraham marries again, and this is not listed here.
Right. Couture.
He has a bunch of sons.
Right. Maybe not as close to death as she thought.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I see in that expression, him as good as dead, it's talking about the barrenness. Yeah, the barrenness of Sarah and Abraham as far as a descendant through Sarah was concerned. You know, without the help of God, it wasn't going to happen.
And I really like your point about how this tells us the result of her rebuke, that clearly she repented and had faith in God. I mean, that's what it clearly states right there. And sometimes in the Old Testament, we're not always told how the story turns out, but it's encouraging to know that maybe there was repentance in some of these cases where we kind of wonder, well, how did they respond? Well, that maybe not be the point of the story. We might wonder about their ultimate state, but that gives us a lot of hope for Sarah, that says that she had confidence in God and his promise. The record leaves us, in the Old Testament, leaves us scratching our head a little bit about that, but here we have this inspired commentary on that says that she had faith.
Well, Eric, let me throw one more thought in regards to what you just said. There might be another way of looking at it as well. What we see here, if you were to describe Abraham's life and Sarah's life in one word, it'd be faith. You know, they had their moments, but I think from the get-go, when Abraham received the promise, I think it's safe to say that Sarah had faith. It's just through the waiting of the 24 years roughly, that she thought she could take care of it herself with Hagar, and different things like that. But and I'm not saying that there wasn't a repentance when the Lord rebuked her the year out, but I think that the writer here is focused on one thing, the thing that drove Abraham and Sarah from the time God called them, and gives us great hope too. You know, we may have mistakes within our lives, but as long as our overall drive is faithfulness and service unto God, we know we're going to be okay. Yeah. All right, back to you all the way.
All right, I think we've got about 4 minutes remaining if we try to stop on time, and we're at a good point in the chapter for a break in the thought, because he makes a little summary here before he picks back up with his train of thought and continues. So if you guys agree, we'll look at this little summary statement and discuss it, and then we'll wrap it up for today.
Sounds good. Remind me again, you're reading from the English Standard Version?
Yes.
That's what I thought. Okay. That's what I had up there earlier. So whenever you're ready, I've got it ready to go.
All right. We'll go with verses 13 through 16 and then come back and comment on it. These all, so far, everyone we've looked at from Abel down to Sarah, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. I'll make a couple of comments about this and then just throw it open to you guys. First of all, we see there that, again, this emphasis on death, that they died, but their faith continued and they continue. And so their faith continues on beyond the grave. And they were looking forward to promises that they did not receive in their own lifetime, as Brian pointed out, but they saw them from afar. In our chat room, there's been some back and forth continuing between Stephen and Brian, but Stephen mentions John 8:56, where Jesus says, Abraham saw my day and was glad. And that's true that Abraham, by faith, looked off into the future, into the fulfillment of that promise that God made to him, and he saw it. And in the same way, we can see heaven. We can see what is yet to come by faith. We see what can't be seen with with our earthly physical eyes. And that's the point he's making about all these characters died without having laid their eyes on that ultimate fulfillment of the promise, but greeting it from afar. And he says that one of the things they're looking for and looking forward to was a heavenly country. Now, that is a subject of great interest to me, that what did the people of the Old Testament understand about the afterlife? And there's very, very little said about it. In fact, this is one of the more definitive statements, and it's in the New Testament. But it gives us some insight that they understood something about a home that was yet to come, that they were able to even face their own death with a hope and a confidence. And I think that's the point that the author's hoping his audience will get from their examples. And with that, I'll let you guys say whatever you'd like to say about it.
You know, in this, I think that, and you bring out the point, faith extends beyond this life, which is really the point. You know, I recently preached a sermon on heaven, and we need to every once in a while just remind ourselves of why we do what we do. And certainly there are many reasons that ought to motivate us, but one of those reasons is we look to a reward in heaven when this life is over. And I look at these verses here, and I see that heaven's a real place. And that's the point when he talks about, you know, earlier in verse 10, the city that has foundation, and here it's a heavenly country. He has prepared a city. He's prepared a place that we are looking forward to going to. And so even if we don't have full realization in this life of God's promises, everything that we think we ought to have, in the life to come, it will all work out. And incidentally, that's why our treasure needs to be there. Matthew chapter 6, 19 to 21. Our treasure needs to be in heaven, and we will receive our eternal reward when this life is over, even if things don't go great in this life.
Okay. Let's see.
You had mentioned earlier.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
You had mentioned earlier that the theme of endurance being so important. Chapter 12, of course, the first part of that really hammers that down. You see a good example of that here, too, the concept of endurance, the idea of being people that looked ahead. I like verse 16, that their desire to look ahead to the promises of God and to be faithful and live with the difficulties of their lives in order to receive these things, that God would say, I'm not ashamed to be their God. That perhaps this idea of those who endure such things, as we saw back in chapter 10 to a degree too, in the language he talked about there of God would not forget the things that they had done, that this idea of how it was that they lived in a way looking ahead. God's not ashamed. He's prepared a place for them, is an important idea that we want to consider as we look at that.
Yeah, and you also have the idea here that faith is not forced. I find it interesting that, you know, God makes these promises, and they embraced and confessed that they were strangers. In the verse 15, where he talks about, you know, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. God did not force them to go through with these things. They demonstrated their trust in him by the way that they lived their lives, which is why, I guess if you want to say it physically, Abraham didn't go back to Mesopotamia. Or maybe that's why he didn't build himself a city in the land of Canaan. As a matter of fact, Abraham ends up purchasing one piece of property. It was a cave.
That's right.
It was a cave. And it was a burial place, which within itself demonstrated his faith in God, that he was going to carry out his promises in his time.
Yeah. It's a great point.
John, did you have something you wanted to add? I don't know if John had to step away. The time, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
To tie into your thought, Tom, at the end of chapter 10, he said, my righteous one shall live by faith, but if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. We are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed. It sounds like a locker room talk at halftime. So the coach has the team together, and he's like, look, guys, the first half is over and it's in the books, but now we're going to get out there. We're going to, we're not going to quit. And so we can't shrink back. And you don't see Abraham turning around and going back home and saying, man, this is hard. I'm going to go back. I want to go back to where I came from. And I think that's the point for his audience there is, look, you've made it this far. You've already struggled some. What you've got to do now is endure. You can't shrink back. And these all died in faith. They carried that to the grave. And it doesn't really matter. We'll see this next week. Even if you had to be sawn in two, which I cannot fathom a worse way to go. But if you died in faith, the story's going to have a happy ending for you. And that is the message, I think, of this. Hang in there. Don't give up.
Yeah.
John?
All righty. Well, I think that brings us to the top of the hour, maybe a little bit past, Eric. And we have covered in our discussion down through verse 16. Do we want to plan then to resume this next week with verse 17?
Sounds good to me.
Let's plan to do that. Let's see. Let's start with any final thoughts or comments. Eric, we'll come back to you last since you started our study. But Brian, do you have any final thoughts or comments for today's study?
Maybe one last thing. Verse 13 talks about being strangers and exiles on the earth. And we remember that this world is not our home. That we are, we talked about this in our lesson on Sunday, we are ambassadors of Christ here. An ambassador lives in another country. He lives under the laws of his own country, but he respects those of the other one. And he lives to represent his nation to those that he's among. We're ambassadors of Christ. This world is not our home. We're but ambassadors here. Our residence, our citizenship is with the kingdom of heaven. And as we represent Christ to the world, we dwell under that law, and we need to remind ourselves that it's only temporary. That's how Abraham did what he did, by reminding himself that it was just temporary and that what was permanent had yet to come.
All right. Good points. Tom, any final thoughts or comments?
No, I appreciate this chapter. Just like back then, we're living in a time where it is so important that we understand what real faith is and that we strive to live by it. It's easy for us as preachers to stand up and tell you to live by faith. It's easy to stand up and say trust God, or say you're not trusting God enough. But in all honesty, we know that it's a whole lot easier to say than it is to do. And that's why I emphasize faith is not believing in God or merely believing in God. It is believing God. And that's hard, but we can do it. And we've got examples that we can look to as we run this race. And that's one of the points of these examples we've seen in Hebrews, and you all will continue to see as the chapter develops.
Okay. And Eric, any final thoughts or comments?
I don't really have much to add. I feel like I've done more than my share of talking today, but I really have been encouraged by you guys. That's one of the things that he said in chapter 10 is that we stir up and encourage one another and provoke one another. And I appreciate you encouraging me, and hopefully it's been encouraging to anyone who's joined in with us. It's certainly a very encouraging chapter.
Absolutely. And I appreciate your efforts today, Eric, in leading us through the first half of 1 Corinthians, Hebrews chapter 11, and looking forward to the continuation of it next week. Now, hopefully we'll have Wayne. He will be absent a bit of wisdom next Wednesday. Gives you a little hint as to what's being extracted from Wayne today. And so we hope that it went well and that he recovers from that okay. Paul may not be with us, and Tom, you'll be on the road traveling next Wednesday. So by all means, we definitely need to have you with us next week as we continue our study through Hebrews chapter 11. Lord willing, if everything goes according to plan, we will begin our study at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
Noon Eastern.
9 a.m. Pacific.
10 a.m. Mountain Time.
It's right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.